Welcome to The Access. My name is Hevi Buzo. Our first guest for tonight's episode is U.S. Congressman Adam Kinzinger, who is a member of the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee at the U.S. Congress. Please stay tuned. Thank you so much for giving me the time today.
Sure.
Once again, Congressman Adam Kinzinger, you are one of the admired people by pro-democracy, pro-freedom people in the Middle East, and especially Syria. You've been very active on this issue, and now we're seeing more like high tension, let's say, between the United States, its supported forces, and Iran, the Assad regime, during the war against ISIS. What is going on, in your opinion, there?
Well, it's a very complicated situation, and I think the West and actors for freedom missed a big opportunity to make a difference in 2013. I think we could have had an easier transition, although no transition is going to be easy when you talk about a change in government. But now it's very complicated. You have the Russians involved, you have the Iranians that have invested a significant amount of blood and treasure in keeping Assad in power. And so what you have now is basically the United States still fighting the Islamic State, as we should do, but now it's mixing up with the interest of Assad. Look, Assad does not want any of America's allies to have any piece of Syria when this is done. And so we're beginning to see an escalation by him, but I think he's miscalculated our resolve to push back against that.
When you talk about miscalculations by the Assad regime and Iran, some people are fearing that the United States is not invested enough, that they are actually willing to escalate when the time comes to stop Iran completely in Syria. What is the overall policy of the United States or the current administration against Iran in Syria?
Well, we've pushed back against Iran in a lot of areas. I think in the broader Middle East, when you look at the fight in Yemen and elsewhere, we're countering Iranian influence in Iraq. We need to continue to do that. And in Syria to an extent. But I think right now we're channelized and focused, I think somewhat wrongly, on just the fight on ISIS. What I fear is actually that this escalates without it being on our terms, without it being our plan. When it all comes down to it, though, obviously we don't seek a fight with the Russians. We don't seek a fight. But I think the only way to have true transition to peace in the Middle East and in Syria, and frankly to liberate the territory of not just ISIS, but the ideology, is going to have to be through replacing Bashar al-Assad. And I think it's going to get to the point, unfortunately, where there are going to have to be targeted strikes against the regime to force a negotiated solution. And hopefully we can get to that point sooner than later.
Do you think the administration is actually prepared for such a confrontation or finally facing the Assad regime?
Well, the United States is fully prepared because we have amazing capability to do what we need to do. You saw it in the shoot down of a Sukhoi 22. This is basically a Vietnam-era type fighter against one of the highest, most advanced jet fighters on the planet. We're very good. So we're prepared to that extent. In terms of something spiraling out of control...
Willingness.
Willingness. The willingness side is, I think they're getting the grip. This is a very complicated policy. The president has very good people around him that I think understand the broader issues. But he's made clear the first fight is against ISIS. So I think what you're going to see is continuing to take the fight against ISIS, but here's the problem, is what happens in the aftermath. You have a lot of different interests now in Syria, and that's going to be where the art of negotiating this comes through. And I think they are developing a proper plan for that, but as we've seen in Syria and elsewhere, it's just very hard to predict how this ends up.
A lot of people were optimistic about the new leadership in the administration by General Mattis, General McMaster, because they understand the region, they have experience working there, they're very clean on Iran. But we saw the article that was published a few days ago talking about basically kind of a lack of understanding or mutual basically like policy between the White House and the Pentagon, talking about having people in the National Security Council wanting to face Iran full-on, confrontation with Iran, and Mattis actually not wanting to do so, which is kind of surprising because Mattis is known to be the most, strong or tough on Iran.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, there's a lot of competing interests in the world, and I think we sometimes can get channelized on what's happening in the Middle East, but we have to remember that you have a resurgent Russia in Eastern Europe. You have the United States and its allies standing up the European Reassurance Initiative in an area where we've never had infrastructure, military infrastructure before. I was recently in Latvia and saw firsthand that difficulty. So we have multiple areas we're trying to handle right now, not to mention North Korea, not to mention China. And so I think prioritizing how we take on the enemies of freedom is what I think Mattis is very good at. So I think right now is not the right time for a full military confrontation with Iran, but if we can push back against them through our allies, through saying, hey, if you enter the deconfliction zone, we will bomb your allies because that's a danger to us and our allies. I think that's a way to continue to push back while we handle some of these other priorities like ISIS, like Assad, like Europe, like North Korea.
Are you suggesting in any way that facing Assad is actually the easier way than facing Iran, and facing Assad would be the way to get Iran out of Syria?
Well, the two are I think partially, yes. The two are very linked, obviously, right now. I think when we saw in 2013, when we were literally hours from executing a strike against the Assad regime, we saw members of the Syrian government flee because they knew this was the end. And it was the failure to do that that led to this resurgence of the Assad government. I think if we make clear, and it's going to take some time to prepare the groundwork, but we make clear that we are going to retaliate against the Assad regime when they bomb innocent civilians, when they bomb hospitals. We're not seeking again to escalate with the Russians. That's a very different fight. But if we take some strikes to the Assad regime, we decapitate Assad from his fielded forces so that he can't communicate with them. I think that's the kind of thing that can force all the parties to the table to a negotiated solution. But we've been very clear. You know, we have lines, red lines, whether it's through the use of chemical weapons or through flying against our allies, that we simply will not tolerate violations of. And I think President Trump has done a great job of kind of silent strength in that.
I've had a conversation with one of the Pentagon spokespeople, and he was very clear about handing over the areas that are liberated from ISIS to Arab Sunnis or people from the same demographics of these areas. There are reports, though, and I can tell you personally, hearing from people who used to report against ISIS and now they are in the liberated parts around Raqqa, telling us that they are fearing that there's a lot of pro-Assad militias that are trying to come in and take over these areas, or sometimes in disguise. And they are very afraid that those liberated areas are going to be handed to the Assad regime. Could that possibly happen, in your opinion?
Well, I hope not. I think there's no doubt that Bashar al-Assad wants those areas back, which is, I think, why you saw the strike against American allies and the strike near our allies, because he sees the Syrian Defense Forces as much of an enemy, frankly, more of an enemy probably than ISIS. I think he's used ISIS in the past to his advantage. So I hope that's not the case. I would imagine and strongly believe that our Pentagon and our civilian infrastructure is thinking through the post-game here. But there's no doubt the post-ISIS game in Syria and frankly in Iraq is going to be very complicated. You're going to have activated Shia militias now that have been fighting basically against ISIS that now are going to be upset at American troops in Iraq. We know
in
these
Iraq,
folks
yes.
in Iraq. And we know these folks do not enjoy time where they're not fighting. So it's a concern we have, but I think we have to fight the near target in front of us, which is defeating the state of ISIS, and then in the meantime, planning for the post-game.
The war on Raqqa seemed to be faster and easier than expected, and now the next goal would be their Zor. How do you see the escalation there, especially that we see the interest of Iran and then Assad trying to take over, and they already have some forces, the Assad regime, inside of their Zor. How do you see this being handled by the United States and the coalition?
Well, again, it's extremely complicated. I think we're going to continue to press the fight, to the extent that there is some mix of whether they're Assad regime forces or Iranian regime forces. That's something that we're going to have to handle, but I think that's mostly going to have to be handled in the aftermath, unfortunately, because I think to expand this now, so targeted strikes against Iranian militias, by the way, would probably not be a good act right now. But again, we set up deconfliction zones and say, here are our forces, here is American interest. Don't come near them. And if you come near them, there will be severe consequences. And despite Russia saber rattling that they're going to target our aircraft, they know darn well that to target our aircraft, our assets, is going to mean the end of their S-300 and S-400 missile defense system and the end of Assad's Air Force. And so I don't think they're going to try it. But again, the post-game, the post-situation is going to be really complicated.
You're one of the voices talking in Washington about having ISIS expanding, and we see the operations all over the world by ISIS fighters and sympathizers, is because of what happened in Syria and allowing Assad to stay in power. Do you see this as something being realized today by the majority of people in the United States, by the people in the American government, Congress. I mean, this happens throughout years of people seeing firsthand what's happening.
I think some are coming to the understanding, but I think it's really hard for people to make the connection between Assad and the growth of ISIS. It's a very complicated argument, and it's very real, though. But I think people trust leadership when it comes to foreign policy. So if President Trump puts forward a plan after the end of ISIS that includes a transition from the Assad government, then people will listen to that and hear and understand. Members of Congress like me making this case, I think, is very important too. But there's no doubt to defeat ISIS is not going to be just liberation of territory, because there'll be an ISIS 2, an ISIS 3, an Al-Qaeda 3. You can defeat people that exist in an organization, but you can't defeat an ideology. And the problem is, I think we're a little too short-sighted in terms of saying liberate territory. We have to liberate people's minds. And you do that by fighting the next generational war on terror, which is understanding that the 7- and 8-year-olds today that are in refugee camps or in lands have two choices. They can either become hopeless and a great fertile recruiting ground for the next generation of ISIS, or they can have hope and optimism. And if they have hope and optimism, they're much less likely to be recruited. That's why you don't see wholesale large amounts of Muslims turning extreme in the United States, because there is hope and opportunity for them. And so that's where I think we have to look at the long target and frankly understand that in a war on terror, this is going to be a 50-year fight, just like the Cold War. It's going to take next generations to liberate their religion of that thought.
Do you think people are prepared in understanding that this is what it is? It's a long-term fight. It's not only about gaining the territory now.
Yeah, I do think so. And if you look at Afghanistan, for instance, there's still pretty strong American support for Afghanistan. The Afghan people, 80% of them or so, support American involvement there. That's been a 16-year fight, and that's the longest war we've been in, and yet we continue to understand the cost of inaction. We saw that, you see it every day in Europe now, as they have more terrorist attacks than what Israel used to have back in the day. And so this is a very serious issue, and I think the American people are ready. We're not in, I guess you can argue in the hindsight of history, this might be considered like a World War III just because of the broad scope of it, but the intensity is pretty low grade, but we have to continue to stay on our A game and on offense. As the old saying goes, you may not be interested in war, but war may be interested in you.
Do you think Russia is willing to let go of Assad, seeing that there's a new leadership in Washington that is a stronger, more, willing to do and to confront when time comes to it?
I think that the Russians are realizing they're getting very mired down right now in Syria, and there's a cost to that. The Russian economy is shrinking, the Russian population is shrinking, and despite having a broad array of nuclear weapons, and they are a great power, I think it's important to recognize their power, but at the same time, they are mired in a conflict that I think they want a way out of, which is why I think a negotiated solution, look, I'd love to see Assad pulled out on a stretcher, to be honest with you. I think he's a terrible man and deserves every ounce of that. But if we can even negotiate a solution where he leaves power, and we can maintain the institutions of the state that people trust in Syria, we can have an end to this. But I think the Russians, in my estimation, probably want this over as much as we do. But their pride is probably going to stop them from leaving the country anytime soon.
There's going to be a meeting between President Trump and Putin. What do you think there's going to be laid down on a table in regards to Syria?
Well, it'll be hard to tell. I think the president will be very strong on Ukraine, for instance. I think he'll be strong on Eastern Europe. I don't necessarily know where he's thinking in terms of the Middle East. I hope he makes it clear that Russia can be part of a solution, but Assad cannot be part of a solution in the Middle East. I think it's important to recognize that. In terms of what the conversation is going to be, I just don't know.
And in terms of the new alliances between the United States and the Muslim and Arab world, when we saw the summit in Saudi Arabia, we saw there's a new attempt to actually confront extremism in terms of not only the fighters on the ground with fighting terrorism, but also the ideology spreading hate. Right. How do you view this? Is that enough? Do you appreciate or think that it's a positive thing to see the participation of Muslim and Arab world?
I think it's very important. I think one of the things President Obama didn't understand, unfortunately, he's a very good man, but I think he misunderstood the importance of American leadership, the ability of the United States to bring together allies and work out deals and work together. It's what we've always been good at. It's why we have such a pivotal role in NATO and the United Nations and elsewhere, because we have that unique ability. So this is a good thing, but there is way more that the Arab and the Muslim world needs to do to counter this. We cannot defeat extremism with military. You can defeat extremists where they exist with military, but you can't defeat the ideology. This has to come from within. It's not going to come from fancy commercials from the United States. It's going to come from Muslim leaders. And I hope this is the beginning of a real understanding by the Saudis and other allies that they play a pivotal role. And frankly, this ideology is putting their regimes at risk too.
Mm-hmm. Finally, I know you have first Syria Caucus in the Congress. I want you to tell me a little bit about it. What is the goal of it? And is there a lot of people participating, and what you're looking to achieve through it?
Well, basically what we want to achieve is bringing people's understanding of what's going on in Syria beyond just the headlines and what you see on television. Chemical attacks, terrible and sad. Bombing of hospitals, terrible and sad. But what's the root cause of what's going on? What's the way out? And I pretend like and think I have a lot of the answers, but the truth is there are experts out there that know way more about this than I. And I want to hear from them, and so do other members of the caucus. So we intend to try to grow this, to try to create kind of a brain central where people can discuss solutions to the problem. Because this is very important to realize. Syria, it's not like a house on fire in a neighborhood that someday burns down and everybody just laments at how sad it was. It's like a fire in an apartment complex. And if it's left untreated, left unfixed, it's going to spread to the broader Middle East, to the broader apartment complex. So I think it's important that we realize that and not just be sad about the humanitarian side of it.
Do you see a lot of response from other members of the Congress, people who probably didn't care as much previously?
Yeah, there's a lot of good response. The thing people have to realize is members of Congress, for the most part, are elected to deal with domestic issues, and a lot of them don't come out here with a lot of foreign policy expertise or interest. A lot do, but some don't. And so trying to bring just even basic interest to people is what we're hoping to do for those that don't, and hopefully get some real solutions here.
I want to thank you so much for giving me the time today.
Anytime.
Once again.
Thank you. Take care.